Hello, women in literature students. This video is designed to provide some background information about the women writers we will read this week. First, we will consider British women writers in the 1600s and the 1700s. Women who were writing at this time tended to be upper class and well off, which makes sense because writers need leisure time and education and to be literate. Women didn't tend to have formal educations. Most women weren't sent to school. But if they were fortunate, they would be educated by their families with tutors or governesses, or maybe by their own efforts, such as by reading books in the family library or conversing with other educated people, such as their brothers or their fathers. I want to introduce some of the women writers whose works we will be reading this week. First, Margaret Cavendish, who was born into a wealthy family. She married a duke who was also very wealthy and very supportive of her writing. Because of the politics around the British Civil War, she and her husband lived in exile in France. She wrote poetry, she wrote prose, she wrote drama, and she earned the nickname of Mad Marge of Newcastle. You might see why when you read her piece called Female Orations, which is a discussion among several speakers who are considering the rights of women. This excerpt from one of the speakers who points out how life is unfair for women. She speaks from a woman's point of view when she says, "For men are happy and we women are miserable. They possess all the ease, rest, pleasure, wealth, power, and fame, whereas women are restless with labor, easeless with pain." Quite a combination of the state of women's lives in contrast to the position of men. Catherine Phillips, also a well-off woman, married quite young. She was educated at a boarding school, which was rather unusual for the time. She wrote plays and she wrote poems, and she had her works published. She was part of a group called the Society of Friendship that included other women writers with whom she corresponded and shared her writing. They supported each other in their endeavor to be serious authors. The poem you will read by Phillips is titled A Married State, and even though her marriage was a happy one, she writes from a woman's point of view about how marriage was not always a good deal for women. The married state affords but little ease. The best of husbands are so hard to please. You'll see this theme of women's unhappiness with marriage echoed in other writers this week. Aphra Behn was quite an intrepid and unusual woman. She worked as a spy for the King of England, and when she was widowed, she became poor, and poor people were put into debtor's prison, which was partly the impetus for her to write, because she could make money by doing so. Even though it was the fashion of the time to write bawdy poetry and plays, ones that had sexual innuendos, when a woman like Behn did it, it was scandalous. I think you'll see from Behn's poems that she does portray the sexuality of women in a very mischievous way. Here is the end of her poem titled The Willing Mistress. By the way, mistress in this case does not have the contemporary meaning of an adulterous affair. It simply means a young woman. A young woman, in this case, was glad to receive the attention of her lover. As Behn writes, "He did but kiss and clasp me round, whilst those his thoughts expressed, and laid me gentle on the ground. Who can guess the rest?" Well, I think we can figure that out. Lady Mary Cudley, also married and self-educated, was part of a literary group of women. Like other women writers we will read this week, she published her poems and tended to write on feminist themes, such as how women, and particularly wives, are unequal to men or to their husbands. You will see this theme reflected in her poem, To the Ladies, which opens with a memorable line, "Wife and servant are the same, but only differ in the name." Well, that's a bit of a hyperbole, but she wants to make her point about how women are subjugated once they are married. Anne Finch was maid of honor to the Queen, which was indeed an honor and more like a companion than a maid. She was happily married. In fact, she dedicated many of her poems to her husband. She also published her work and was recognized by other well-known writers of the time, such as Jonathan Swift, the author of Gulliver's Travels, and Alexander Pope, who wrote many essays. Finch's poem, The Introduction, describes how women who are writers do not receive the same acclaim that men do. She opens with the lines, "Alas, a woman that attempts the pen, such an intruder on the rights of men. Such a presumptuous creature is esteemed the fault by no virtue be redeemed." In other words, she suggests that writing is the domain of men, and that if a woman tries to write, even if she writes well, she will not be esteemed. Her work will not be valued. Finally, Lady Montagu was also born into a wealthy family and educated at home, had free access to her father's library where she could read the classics in Greek and Latin, which tended to be the standard for a good education. She wrote about how women should be educated and how women should be equal to men. However, you will notice that Montagu, like all the other women writers we will read this week, are upper-class women, and that's where the focus of their writing tends to lie. In a very unusual poem based on a real incident about a young woman named Mrs. Yonge, whose husband was an adulterer and abandoned her, then when Mrs. Yonge fell in love with a man who wanted to be with her, her husband sued her and took her children away, which basically points out the double standard between men and women. So in Montagu's poem, she imagines Mrs. Yonge writing to her husband about the situation. For wives ill used, no remedy remains, to daily racks condemned, to eternal chains. As you read this week, try to find some works that you enjoy or appreciate. You don't have to like everything. Try to find something you connect with. Feel free to ask any questions either in your posts or in the discussion area. I do hope you will enjoy reading the women writers this week. Have fun.